Welcome to Life, the Universe and Me, the chance to think about and discuss life's stupidly big and difficult questions. If you've got this far, then you've probably done quite a bit of thinking about why you exist, what it means to be human, how you make ethical decisions, and what will happen when you die. They are stupidly big questions, but if you don't try to answer them, you'll never know if you can. This is session 5, where we are considering some answers the Bible gives to some of the questions we've been asking. Many of these questions have been foundational questions, so it seems to make sense to look for biblical answers in the first book of the Bible, called Genesis, or literally coming into being. The trouble is that Genesis is a storybook. We still have to do the hard work of interpreting the stories. But since the stories are so famous, let's give it a go. The first story is of creation, represented here as God, the crown, creating the world, the circle. We're told that in 6 days God creates the world and fills it, and that on the 7th day he rests. There's a rhythm, a cycle to the story. God creates and it is good. God creates and it is good. Eventually God creates humans, women and men, and it is very good. He puts them in a garden paradise called Eden, naked and unashamed. They can eat from any tree they like, except from two, the tree of knowledge of good and evil and the tree of life. The story answers some of our questions about existence. Do we exist? Yes, we do. Why do we exist? Because God decided existence was better than non-existence. We see an explanation for our existence that satisfies Occam's razor. A creator made it so. We also start to answer questions of identity. All that God created was good. Humanity was very good and created in what it calls the image of God. We're not just clever animals. We are valuable. Whoever we are, however clever or beautiful or capable, you are valuable. We know the story. We know that they could eat fruit from any tree, except the trees of life and of knowledge. So here are the first questions for you to pause, discuss, and consider. Why does perfection include the possibility to disobey God? And how would life today be different if everything and everyone were perfect as we were created to be? The next story is called The Fall, represented by a person moving from under God's crown, God's rule, to live under their own little crown, their own rule. The story is this. A snake appears in the Garden of Eden and entices Adam and Eve to disobey God and eat from the tree of knowledge. They eat, and suddenly they are ashamed to be naked in front of each other, and they hide from God, who obviously knows exactly what's happened. The consequence is that God expels them from Eden, and now the whole creation is cursed. Humanity's relationships with God, with the world, and with each other are badly damaged. But God still loves them. He clothes them, and he prevents them in their fallen, cursed state from eating from the tree of life, and therefore living cursed forever. Again, it answers foundational questions. Are we free to make choices, or is everything an unavoidable consequence of circumstance and brain chemistry? As it turns out, we are free. We can make supernatural, meaning unpredictable, choices. We are not in an iron cage of fate or karma. But it also means that when it comes to ethics, our sense of right and wrong, there is at least one categorical imperative. Obey God. We must obey God. As we see, when we don't, the curse falls. Humanity is banished from the garden, and God, who was close, is now distant. Now sinful humanity could not stand the immediate presence of God. But is the fall and God's curse the final state for humanity? Think disease, death, natural disasters, human greed, selfishness, and inequality. Could this world be any worse than it is? We know the world could be better, but could it also be worse? Pause. The third story is Noah and the flood. We know the story, or at least we think we do. The animals come in 2 by 2. Hurrah! The flood comes, and people and animals are saved. God then sends a rainbow as a promise never to flood the world again. But why did God flood the world in the first place? We're told because of the wickedness, corruption, and evil, not just of a few people, but of all humanity except for Noah. And God thinks nothing of wiping out the evil. It's sobering. And it's represented in the picture series as someone dead before God. The story of the flood speaks to our sense of purpose. Do we decide our own purpose? No, because God expects righteousness or goodness from us. It speaks to our ethics. Is there judgment? Yes. Why be good? Because evil leads to death. At the end of the story, God promises in the rainbow never again to exercise this kind of in this life, direct, natural justice kind of judgment. But the point of the story is to look forward to an ultimate judgment where human evil will lead to death. Unless we are spotless, we are to some degree evil and therefore in danger. So 2 questions. Does God have the right to destroy his own creations? And why does this idea offend or unsettle us? Next up is a story that to our sensibilities is just as barbaric as the flood. God first makes a promise to Abraham that his descendants will be as numerous as the stars in the sky and the sand on the seashore. And then shockingly, God tells Abraham to sacrifice his son Isaac on Mount Moriah, which very significantly is the same place that is now called Temple Mount in Jerusalem, the site of the Jewish temples, the spot where sacrifice took place. They travel to the mountain. Isaac asks his father, "Where is the lamb for the sacrifice?" Abraham answers, "God will provide." And just as Abraham is about to kill his son, God calls him to stop. A ram caught in the thicket becomes a substitute. The ram is a kind of Jesus, innocent but sacrificed in Isaac's place, the provision of God. I'm representing this story with Jesus, obedient under God's rule, being sacrificed on the cross. Abraham played a very high-stakes version of Pascal's wager, not just risking a life of devotion to a non-existent God, but risking the sacrifice of his son. He stakes everything on God being real and having a higher purpose, and it paid off. But do we trust his evidence? Do we trust his testimony of God's intervention? The story points towards God's actual gone through with it sacrifice of his one and only son, Jesus. Do we believe the evidence for that? There's plenty of it, lots of historical evidence, but do you believe you are valuable enough for God in Jesus to sacrifice himself for you? The ram becomes a sacrifice or substitute in Isaac's place. Why might God demand a price be paid for human rebellion? And in this case, who pays the price? We all know the story of Joseph and his coloured coat, but again, what's the story really about? Joseph's brothers get angry with him. They sell him to be a slave and fake his death. After this kind of, in inverted commas, death, Joseph rises again, not just to a new life, but to a life of complete victory and rule. He rises to rule ancient Egypt. Not just that, but he rises to save from famine and death in Canaan those who, again, in inverted commas, killed him. Joseph becomes a kind of Jesus. Hence the picture, Jesus as God, risen and ruling over the created world. The story points forwards to the fact that death is not an ending. We consider the evidence from near-death experiences or seance. Not only is death not an ending, but because of Joseph's victorious life, his family get to live with him in Egypt because of what Joseph has done and relying on his reputation and not their own. In the wider Christian understanding, it points towards Jesus. So here is the question. Joseph dies and rises again to save his family from famine. Jesus dies and rises again to save who from what? And today's final story is called Jacob's Ladder. Jacob is a rebel. He steals his brother's birthright. He deceives his father. He runs away like a coward. But despite all this, God gives him a powerful vision in a dream of a stairway to heaven, with the Lord at the top, remaking the promises given to Abraham to him. He still doesn't wholeheartedly follow God. So another night, not in a dream this time, but as he lies awake, an angelic figure comes and wrestles with him all night. He struggles with God. Jacob demands his blessing, but still doesn't really believe. Finally, years later, after he hears of the risen Joseph, God appears to him again, telling him to go to where Joseph is in Egypt. And only now, finally, at the end of the story, does Jacob obey and do what God wants him to do. It's represented here by a decision picture, a decision we all must make, whether we make the decision actively or passively without engaging with it. Will we follow pictures 2 and 3, going our own way and living by the consequences? Or will we live by the categorical imperative to obey God? We discuss conscience. Conscience tells us which way to go. It'd probably be a good idea to engage our conscience as we decide whether or not to take Pascal's wager ourselves. So my final questions. Jacob really struggles with the idea of living under God's rule. But what convinces him? What would convince you to trust Jesus as the spotless one who, because he loves you, dies in your place, satisfying God's justice and saving you from the death consequence of choosing to disobey God? Thanks for taking part, and I pray that some of these answers will have been eternally helpful for you. Enough brain ache. Stop thinking and go and do something about it.